Hi everyone, I'm Paul Orfanos, National Community Engagement Manager at Delphi Bank, which is a division of the Bendigo Adelaide Group, and welcome to Delphi Connect, a segment where, as part of our commitment to community engagement, we bring you leading experts from fields as far and wide as economics and the markets, property, health, scientific research, the arts, community affairs, just to name a few. Hopefully you'll find our segments both informative and enjoyable. Let's move straight on to today's guest, Scott Keck, who is chairman of Charter Keck Kramer, one of Australia's leading independent strategic property consulting firms. Scott, thanks for joining us today.
Good morning, Paul.
Firstly, how have you and your colleagues been coping with these challenging times?
Well, they certainly are challenging, but look, we're coping extremely well. Our operating platforms are 100% open. We're receiving instructions. Our KPIs are being met. Yes, most of our people are working remotely, but in this firm, they've been used to that for some time. So this challenge wasn't completely new, and I'm pleased to say that everything's operating smoothly, and overall the staff seem happy and very energetic.
Well, that's great to hear. Let's move straight on, Scott, to the last quarter in property sales. What can you tell us about sales turnover trends and their effect on property values over this last quarter? And has there been a large difference between the Sydney and Melbourne markets?
Well, understandably, there has been a slowing in sales turnover. You need to look at the categories, though. In the residential markets, there are established inner urban homes, there are apartments. On the urban fringe, there are new house and land packages, townhouses, and so on. So there's no uniform result of sales turnover. House and land packages, as a result of government incentives, have been boosted and they're quite strong. Inner urban sales in the higher value markets have been slower, but values have not shown any significant decline. Probably the sector most affected has been apartment sales, and those that were in the market as stock able to be purchased, but which were really of an investor specification rather than better quality own your own stock. Land sales have also been a little bit quieter. And of course, outside the residential market, there's a variety of market influences. But overall, the residential markets, despite what you hear, and I know we'll come to it shortly, sales turnover is slower, but the downturn in values is not yet that pronounced.
Okay, it's interesting to hear. Now, Scott, there's been some predictions that residential property values will decrease from pre-COVID values, and I've heard many percentages put forward from 5% on the one hand to 30% on the other. What's your view?
Well, Paul, look, I'm pleased you raised this because it helps your listeners to understand. You can't have a prediction of a uniform number across the whole of the property markets because, as I just said, they're made up of a number of different categories which perform differently. For example, inner urban property is mostly influenced by people of greater socioeconomic capacity, and it's not affected by population growth or immigration, which are the variables that do affect other parts of the market. So there's been little impact, noticeable impact on values there. And what people need to understand is this. As interest rates get lower, mortgage payments get closer to being rental payments at the same value. And when you get mortgage rates, mortgage payments and rental payments being similar in the lower value range of up to about 600,000 with a sort of a 75% loan to value ratio, a lot of people decide to buy rather than be renters. Another factor is that we all know there's a lot of people who wanted to buy into the property markets who have been unable to do so because of affordability. Affordability doesn't need to reduce very much and before it gives these people an opportunity to step in. So they sort of underpin the fall from going too far. And the other thing is that although population growth will be down because we have reduced immigration, immigration really only drives two segments of the market. That's rental accommodation and new house and land packages on the urban fringe. What drives the inner urban markets is the changing demographic that's already resident Australian and part of the Australian existing population. So it's very wrong to say, A, that there's one uniform figure, and secondly, our office has just put out a market insight where we think that there will be downturns in value, but we are not nearly as concerned about that as some of the anecdotal commentaries. We think that it could be maybe 10% on the urban fringe, somewhere between 0 and 5% on the inner urban markets for established housing. Probably the most vulnerable is the urban fringe, new house and land packages, typical value $500,000, mum and dad both working, 3 children, one of the parents loses their income, mortgage becomes stressful. That market's vulnerable, but a lot of the market is not vulnerable.
That's a very concise answer. Recently, Scotty, more people are working from home, and there's a growing number of people calling this the new norm. What long-term effects do you feel the pandemic will have on demand for CBD office space and office space in general?
Yes, a good question. Well, certainly people were playing with this idea. What's happened has forced it. People now realise that it's probably more doable in terms of working remotely with all the technical support that's now available. Now, in our own firm, for example, we had 180 staff in our Melbourne office. Everybody's working remotely. I can tell you that not all of them want to stay working remotely all of the time. We've surveyed all of our staff, and I think we'd be typical of a lot of firms in our situation. And what our staff are looking for is a balance. And the most popular balance was, look, I wouldn't mind coming into the office 1 or 2 days a week and working from home 3 or 4 days a week. So I think something like that is going to be a lasting legacy. But I can also tell you that a lot of large organisations still feel that they work best by having their teams together. And through our accommodation division in this office, I know that whilst there are some people considering alternative office accommodation outside of the CBD, a lot of them are looking to strengthen their quality and extent of office accommodation. So it's not all one way. Certainly another aspect of this is, though, I think some people who were living close to the city in apartments because they felt they had to be close to work or in expensive homes now realise that they can probably distance themselves even to semi-regional areas where their real estate will cost them less and they can still function very well. So I think the lifestyle and the work-office balance will change permanently for a lot of people, but it's not going to be deserting entirely the conventional office situation. No, not by any means.
The onset of COVID-19 has affected overseas student numbers. What do you think will be the long-term effects to the segment of the residential market that is very much supported by foreign students?
This is very good thinking through this. I believe that Australia's destiny is very intertwined with the Asian region, Southeast Asia, and of course China, and to some extent India. There is an economic and social imperative for the relationship between Australia and those major countries to remain stable and respectful. And at times it won't always be harmonious. But there, as I say, there are imperative economic and social reasons why we will all coexist in a new world, and in which Australia will be much more significantly part of the Asian region. I think for that reason, coupled with the fact that Australia is still increasingly being perceived as a safe haven and a great destination, I think the foreign students will resume. We need them in our universities. We need them for multicultural reasons. We offer great opportunity to them. And I think that as soon as the borders come down, as soon as COVID-19 is under some sort of treatment regime or control, we'll see a resumption of foreign students wanting to study in Australia. I know if I were an Asian student, I'd be wanting to study in Australia rather than America or Europe. And it also aligns with the fact that our government, both sides of government know, and everybody in Australia should appreciate, that Australia's well-being and economic growth is still very dependent on increasing population growth. And as we resume immigration as well, foreign students will be part of that cohort. But I'd give it a timeline. It's not going to happen immediately. It's probably going to take a couple of years for it to fully recover, I would think, at least. But it will recover.
It's good to hear. If we can now switch our attention to the Airbnb sector for a moment, there was a suggestion in the market that owners of Airbnb properties would shift them away from the short-term market and place them in the long-term rental pool. In your opinion, is this happening?
Well, look, that's understandable. And yes, to a degree it's happened. But let's just think this through. Short-term Airbnb accommodation is for tourism. There are basically two sectors of tourism. One is domestic, one is international. I think that a lot of Airbnb will stay in its short-term strategy as the borders come down and domestic tourism increases significantly. And domestic tourism is likely to increase at levels beyond what it used to be, because it's the alternative, it's the only alternative that a lot of people have got who want to travel. So I think that on the back of significantly increased domestic tourism, Airbnb will find itself sticking to its strategy to the extent that some of it was specifically aimed at international tourists. And if for some reason it can't convert to take advantage of the increased domestic demand, it might fall back into the long-term rental pool. But significantly, I think it will be the borders down and the strong increase in domestic tourism that stops a flood of Airbnb properties coming across to the long-term rental market.
That's great. In your view, what government economic measures will assist the construction industry and the home buyer markets during these uncertain times?
Well, firstly, from a residential perspective, the homeowner grants and other concessions that are being made and filtered through by the federal government down to state level have had an immediate impact, and that will keep a lot of residential construction going as well. And this is vital because the construction industry is one of the biggest sectors nationally. In the non-residential sector, there's a lot of government financed and planned construction for infrastructure, roads, tunnels, schools, hospitals, police stations, civil works. So the government is definitely focusing a lot of funding into construction in both the non-residential and residential areas. It's absolutely vital. Without it, we'd be in a terrible state. And there's little debate at federal level between the government, between the coalition government and the Labor Party that is the right thing to do. And I'm involved on the board of construction companies and property developers, apart from my own organisation. And I know that industry response has been very strong to the wisely chosen government incentives and catalysts, and it's having a very major effect.
Scott, one dream most of us in Australia have has been to own your own home. In your view, is this expectation still as embraced as it once was, or are we going down the European model where people become long-term renters?
Paul, entirely before the advent of COVID-19, we were moving down that pathway in any event. We were moving down that pathway slowly but inevitably because increasingly Australia's had economic challenges. Productivity needs to be improved. Unemployment, real unemployment, taking underemployment into account, was increasing. Real estate values were not decreasing. Saving deposits is a very difficult thing to do when so many of the lower socioeconomic groupings are not able to save anything at all. I think, to be frank, we were going down the pathway of home ownership, the great Australian dream, becoming increasingly elusive for our younger and future generations. I don't think that COVID-19 has really had much difference. It hasn't accelerated, and it's certainly not going to stop it from occurring.
Mm-hmm. And finally, Scott, just a general comment on the Australian economy. How do you see inflation and unemployment playing out over the next 2 years?
Well, just leaving COVID-19 to one side for a moment, I have been concerned for a couple of years, and it's been our Charter Keck Cramer House view that there has been real pressures on the Australian economy. The sinking and lowering Australian dollar's been one influence. Decreasing exports into the broader Asian region in some sectors has been a consideration. Lower productivity due to relatively high wage costs has been another issue. corporate Australia handing out too much money by way of dividends rather than keeping it on its balance sheet for future expansion has been another issue. And global issues and trade issues have got impact. I think before COVID-19 came along, the Australian economy was increasingly presenting a challenge. It's much more of a challenge now, there can be no question. So it's going to require a lot of hard work at government level. I think it's going to require all Australians to tighten their belt to some extent. But unfortunately, when you get slower economic conditions and more challenges, it always affects the people that can least afford it. And I suppose every person needs to reflect where they sit in that socio-economic scale as to whether they've got a problem or not. But I can't see unemployment coming off these new heights to which it's going to reach under COVID-19, probably for 4 or 5 years.
And they certainly are new heights, aren't they?
Yeah. And certainly just that increasing unemployment alone is probably the biggest challenge for the economy.
Scott, thanks for making time to be with us today. Your insights are very much appreciated.
Paul, I'm delighted to have been in the conversation, and I hope that this has been of interest to some of your viewers. Thank you very much.
That's a pleasure. Thanks all for joining us on Delphi Connect today. On behalf of all of us at Delphi Bank, bye for now.